It was a Tuesday morning in 1987 when Jim Bakker's empire came crashing down. The man who had built a multi-million-dollar television ministry, complete with a Christian theme park and luxury hotels, was now sobbing on national television as scandal after scandal tore through the very foundation of his religious empire. But Jim Bakker wasn't alone. He was just the beginning of what would become the most devastating series of evangelical scandals in American history. Scandals so shocking that they would drive millions of believers away from their faith, not with anger, but in stunned, heartbroken silence. The year was 1980, and American evangelicalism was experiencing its golden age. Televangelists commanded audiences in the tens of millions. Pat Robertson's 700 Club reached into living rooms across the nation. Jerry Falwell's moral majority was reshaping American politics. Jimmy Swaggart's fiery sermons drew crowds that filled stadiums, and at the center of it all was Jim Bakker, whose PTL, Praise the Lord, network was generating over $100 million annually. These weren't just preachers, they were cultural titans. They owned private jets, lived in mansions, and wielded influence that reached the highest levels of government. Ronald Reagan actively courted their support. They promised prosperity to their followers. Send in your seed money, they said, and God would bless you 100-fold. Millions believed. Millions gave. And for a while, it seemed like the prosperity gospel was working. But behind the glittering facade of success, cracks were already forming. Jessica Hahn was a 21-year-old church secretary from Long Island when she first encountered Jim Bakker in December 1980. What happened next in that Florida hotel room would remain secret for 7 years. But when it finally surfaced, it would destroy not just Bakker's ministry, but shake the entire evangelical establishment to its core. The encounter itself was devastating enough. Bakker, a married father and supposed man of God, had drugged and sexually assaulted the young woman. But what happened afterward revealed something even more sinister about the evangelical power structure. Instead of facing consequences, Bakker's organization paid Hahn $265,000 in hush money. They painted her as a seductress. They threatened her into silence. And for 7 years, while Bakker continued preaching about morality and family values to millions of Americans, Jessica Hahn lived with the trauma and the silence. The cover-up involved some of the biggest names in evangelicalism. Jerry Falwell himself helped orchestrate the payments. John Fletcher, Bakker's right-hand man, delivered the money. This wasn't just one man's moral failure, this was a systematic conspiracy involving the most powerful religious leaders in America. When the story finally broke in March 1987, courtesy of rival televangelist Jimmy Swaggart, who had leaked it to the Charlotte Observer, the response was swift and brutal. Within days, Bakker resigned from PTL, but the scandal was just beginning to unfold. As investigators dug deeper into PTL's finances, they uncovered a level of fraud that was staggering even by the standards of religious corruption. Bakker had been selling lifetime partnerships in his Heritage USA Christian resort, essentially timeshares in a Christian theme park. He sold over 10,000 partnerships for the Heritage Grand Hotel alone. There was just one problem. The hotel only had 500 rooms. The mathematics were impossible. Bakker had raised over $158 million selling partnerships and accommodations that could never exist. The money that donors thought was going to build a Christian retreat was instead funding Bakker's lavish lifestyle. His air-conditioned doghouse, his Rolls-Royce, his wife Tammy Faye's shopping sprees that included a $100,000 shopping trip in a single afternoon. But even as the Bakker scandal dominated headlines, few could have predicted that it was merely the opening act in a drama that would consume the evangelical world. Hey everyone, this is Professor Archive, and before we dive deeper into these scandals that shook America to its core, I'm curious. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. Also, what's your profession? I love connecting with viewers from all walks of life. And if you're finding value in these deep dives into history's most fascinating stories, consider leaving a super thanks. It really helps keep this channel going and allows me to bring you more of these detailed investigations into the events that shaped our world. While Jim Bakker's world was collapsing, another evangelical giant was watching with apparent satisfaction. Jimmy Swaggart had always positioned himself as the moral conscience of televangelism. He was the one who had exposed Bakker. He was the one who condemned the prosperity gospel as heretical. He was the fire and brimstone preacher who called out sin wherever he saw it, except as it turned out in his own life. On February 21, 1988, less than a year after bringing down Bakker, Jimmy Swaggart stood before his congregation in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and delivered what would become one of the most watched confessions in television history. "I have sinned against you, my Lord," he sobbed, his voice breaking with emotion. "I would ask that your precious blood would wash and cleanse every stain until it is in the seas of God's forgiveness." The sin? Swaggart had been caught in a motel with a prostitute. But this wasn't a one-time moral failure. Investigators revealed a pattern of behavior that stretched back years. Swaggart, who preached against sexual immorality, who condemned rock music as Satan's tool, who built a ministry worth over $150 million on the foundation of moral purity, had been regularly visiting prostitutes for years. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. But what made it even more devastating was the role that internal evangelical politics had played in Swaggart's exposure. The investigation that brought down Swaggart had been initiated by Marvin Gorman, a fellow Assemblies of God minister whom Swaggart had previously accused of adultery. Gorman had hired a private investigator to follow Swaggart, and when they caught him at the Travel Inn motel with Deborah Murphy, Gorman had his revenge. This wasn't just about moral failure. This was about a religious establishment so consumed with power struggles and personal vendettas that they were willing to destroy each other publicly. The Assemblies of God denomination was forced to defront both Bakker and Swaggart, stripping them of their ministerial credentials. But the scandals were far from over. In fact, they were about to get much, much worse. Pat Robertson seemed untouchable. The son of a U.S. senator, a Yale Law School graduate, the founder of the Christian Broadcasting Network and Regent University, Robertson had built perhaps the most respectable evangelical empire in America. Unlike Bakker's gaudy excess, or Swaggart's emotional extremism, Robertson projected an image of sophisticated respectability. He even ran for president in 1988, briefly leading in the Republican primary polls. But respectability couldn't hide the disturbing realities of Robertson's ministry. Throughout the 1990s, a series of investigations revealed that Robertson had used his tax-exempt ministries to enrich himself and his family in ways that would make even secular corporate executives blush. The Christian Broadcasting Network owned a Learjet that Robertson used for personal vacations. His Operation Blessing charity, which was supposed to provide humanitarian aid to the world's poor, was actually being used to support Robertson's business ventures. In Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, planes that were supposed to be carrying humanitarian supplies were instead ferrying equipment for Robertson's diamond mining operation. When questioned about it, Robertson claimed he was trying to help the Congolese people by creating jobs, while pocketing millions in profits. Perhaps most disturbing was Robertson's relationship with dictators and war criminals. He developed a close friendship with Liberian dictator Charles Taylor, a man later convicted of war crimes for his role in Sierra Leone's brutal civil war. Robertson invested heavily in a Liberian gold mine that Taylor helped him acquire, and in return he used his television platform to defend Taylor against international criticism. When the United Nations and the United States imposed sanctions on Taylor's regime due to its support for rebel groups that were committing atrocities, Robertson publicly opposed the sanctions. Here was a man who claimed to speak for Christian values, defending a dictator whose forces were notorious for recruiting child soldiers and committing mass murder. The pattern was consistent across Robertson's international business dealings. In Guatemala, he partnered with Rios Montt, a military dictator responsible for genocide against the country's indigenous population. Robertson not only defended Rios Montt but actively campaigned against international efforts to hold him accountable for his crimes. Back home, Robertson's pronouncements became increasingly extreme and bizarre. He claimed that feminism encouraged women to kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. He suggested that Hurricane Katrina was God's punishment for America's sins. He called for the assassination of Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez on national television. These weren't the off-the-cuff remarks of an aging preacher losing his filter. They were the calculated statements of a man who had discovered that extremism sold. The more outrageous Robertson's statements, the more donations poured in from his dedicated followers. But it was the financial scandals that truly revealed the depth of corruption in Robertson's empire. In 1999, the Virginia Pilot newspaper revealed that Robertson had claimed a tax deduction worth $4 million by donating his thoroughbred horses to his own university. The horses continued to live on Robertson's farm, and he continued to use them for breeding, effectively getting a massive tax break while giving up nothing. The newspaper also revealed that Robertson had used CBN's tax-exempt funds to purchase a stable for his horses, build runways for his private jets, and even buy a backup airplane. When CBN moved its headquarters, Robertson somehow managed to acquire the old building for his personal use at a price far below market value. Perhaps most egregiously, Robertson had created a complex web of for-profit and non-profit entities that allowed him to shift money between them at will. His age-defying shake business, which sold nutritional supplements with dubious health claims, was promoted on CBN programming, creating a direct pipeline from his ministry to his personal business ventures. By the early 2000s, it was clear that the evangelical establishment that had seemed so powerful and unified in the 1980s was rotten to its core. But the full extent of the corruption wouldn't be revealed until the next generation of scandals hit. Ted Haggard was supposed to be the new face of evangelicalism. Young, charismatic, and politically savvy, he had built New Life Church in Colorado Springs into one of America's largest congregations. As president of the National Association of Evangelicals, he represented 30 million American Christians. He had weekly phone calls with the White House. Time magazine named him one of the most influential evangelicals in America. Haggard preached passionately against homosexuality. He supported constitutional amendments to ban same-sex marriage. He counseled gay church members to overcome their sinful desires through prayer and therapy. His church's website explicitly condemned homosexuality as an abomination. On November 2nd, 2006, just 3 days before the midterm elections that would determine control of Congress, a Denver radio station received a phone call that would destroy Haggard's carefully constructed image. The caller was Mike Jones, a male escort who claimed that Haggard had been paying him for sex for 3 years. Jones also claimed that Haggard had purchased methamphetamine from him. Initially, Haggard denied the allegations. "I've never had a gay relationship with anybody," he told a Denver television station. But as evidence mounted, including voicemails that Jones had recorded, Haggard's denials became less convincing. On November 4th, Haggard admitted to his church's board that some of the allegations against me are true. He resigned as senior pastor and from his position with the National Association of Evangelicals. The next day, he issued a letter to his congregation admitting that he was a deceiver and a liar, and that he had a repulsive and dark side to his life. The Haggard scandal was particularly devastating because it struck at the heart of the evangelical political movement. Here was a man who had helped mobilize millions of conservative Christians to vote against gay rights, and he himself had been living a secret gay life for years. The hypocrisy was so blatant, so complete, that it left many evangelicals questioning everything they had been taught about their leaders. But Haggard's fall from grace revealed something even more troubling about evangelical culture: the extent to which leaders would go to maintain their power and influence. Instead of encouraging Haggard to seek genuine help or to live authentically, the evangelical establishment forced him into restoration therapy, designed to cure his homosexuality. For 3 weeks, Haggard was locked away with a team of ministers who claimed they could pray away his gay desires. When he emerged, one of his overseers announced that Haggard was now completely heterosexual, a claim so absurd that it became a punchline on late-night television shows. The real tragedy was that Haggard's secret life had caused genuine harm. His anti-gay preaching had contributed to the marginalization and suffering of countless LGBTQ+ individuals, including members of his own congregation. Young gay Christians who had looked to their church for guidance instead received messages of shame and condemnation from a leader who was himself struggling with his sexuality. Years later, Haggard would admit that the restoration had been a sham and that he was still attracted to men. But by then, the damage to evangelical credibility was irreversible. The scandals of the 1980s and early 2000s had exposed the corruption and hypocrisy of evangelical leadership, but they were nothing compared to what was coming. The 2010s would bring scandals so massive and so disturbing that they would shake not just individual ministries, but entire denominations. In 2016, Baylor University, the world's largest Baptist university, was rocked by a sexual assault scandal that revealed a systematic cover-up reaching the highest levels of the administration. Football players had been accused of rape and sexual assault, but instead of investigating the allegations, university officials had actively worked to silence the victims. The scandal began when a former student named Jasmine Hernandez came forward with allegations that she had been gang-raped by multiple Baylor football players. Instead of taking her seriously, university officials subjected her to what she described as a kangaroo court process designed to protect the athletic program's reputation. When other victims began coming forward, a pattern emerged of university officials discouraging reports, failing to investigate allegations, and even blaming victims for their assaults. The investigation, led by the law firm Pepper Hamilton, revealed that Baylor had created what they called a hostile environment for assault victims. The university's counseling center had actually told some victims that rape was something they would need to forgive and forget. Title IX officials had been pressured to minimize the number of sexual assault cases they reported. Most shocking of all was the role played by Baylor's administration, including President Ken Starr, the same Ken Starr who had investigated President Bill Clinton's sexual misconduct. Starr, who had built his reputation as a moral crusader, had overseen a system that systematically protected sexual predators and silenced their victims. The scandal eventually led to Starr's resignation and the firing of football coach Art Briles, but not before dozens of women had been traumatized by a system that claimed to represent Christian values while actively enabling sexual violence. But even the Baylor scandal paled in comparison to what investigators would uncover about the Southern Baptist Convention, America's largest Protestant denomination. For decades, the Southern Baptist Convention had presented itself as the moral backbone of American Christianity. With over 15 million members and 47,000 churches, it was arguably the most influential religious organization in the United States. Its leaders spoke regularly at the White House. Its annual conventions attracted tens of thousands of delegates. Its seminary presidents were treated as intellectual celebrities in conservative Christian circles. But in February 2019, the Houston Chronicle published an investigation that would shatter the denomination's carefully cultivated image. The newspaper had spent months investigating sexual abuse within Southern Baptist churches and had uncovered evidence of over 700 victims who had been abused by over 200 church leaders and volunteers over the previous 20 years. The scope of the abuse was staggering, but what made it even more horrifying was the systematic cover-up that had enabled it to continue. The investigation revealed that Southern Baptist leaders had routinely moved predators from church to church, failed to report abuse to law enforcement, and silenced victims who tried to speak out. Perhaps most disturbing was the case of Johnny Hunt, a former president of the Southern Baptist Convention who had been credibly accused of sexually assaulting the wife of another pastor. Despite multiple witnesses and compelling evidence, Hunt had been protected by the denomination's leadership. He continued to preach, continued to hold positions of authority, and continued to have access to potential victims. The Chronicle's investigation revealed that this pattern was repeated hundreds of times across the denomination. Pastors who had been convicted of child molestation were quietly moved to new churches where unsuspecting congregations had no knowledge of their criminal history. Church leaders who received reports of abuse routinely counseled victims to forgive and forget, rather than reporting the crimes to police. Most shamefully, the denomination's leadership had actively worked to prevent the creation of a database that would track abusive ministers. At their annual conventions, when abuse survivors had pleaded for basic reforms that would protect children, they had been shouted down by delegates who claimed that such measures would interfere with local church autonomy. The excuse of local church autonomy, the idea that each Baptist church was independent and couldn't be held accountable by the denomination, had become a shield for predators and a weapon against victims. While the denomination claimed it had no authority to intervene in cases of abuse, it had no problem intervening when churches took positions on homosexuality or women's ordination that the leadership didn't like. The investigation sparked a crisis within the Southern Baptist Convention that continues to this day. Thousands of churches have left the denomination. Seminary enrollments have plummeted. The convention's own internal investigation, conducted by Guidepost Solutions, confirmed and expanded upon the Chronicle's findings, revealing that the abuse crisis was even worse than anyone had imagined. The report detailed how the Southern Baptist Convention's executive committee had maintained a secret list of ministers accused of abuse, but had done nothing to warn churches or protect potential victims. They had routinely disparaged abuse survivors as opportunistic and had actively worked to silence their voices. Even as the scandals multiplied and the evidence of systematic abuse became undeniable, many evangelical leaders continued to prioritize their institutions over the victims. Rather than acknowledging the full scope of the problem and implementing meaningful reforms, they engaged in damage control, hired public relations firms, and attempted to minimize the crisis. The psychological impact on ordinary believers has been devastating. These weren't just isolated moral failures, they represented a complete breakdown of the systems that millions of Americans had trusted to provide moral guidance and spiritual leadership. Sarah, a former Southern Baptist from Texas, described her experience this way: "I grew up believing that our pastors were different, that they were called by God, that they were more trustworthy than secular leaders. When I learned that my own denomination had been covering up child abuse for decades, it wasn't just my faith in the church that was shattered, it was my faith in my ability to discern good from evil." This sentiment has been echoed by millions of former evangelicals who have quietly left their churches and their faith. They haven't joined protest movements or written angry blogs. They've simply walked away, too heartbroken and disillusioned to fight. The statistical evidence of this exodus is overwhelming. According to the Pew Research Center, evangelical churches have experienced the steepest decline in membership of any major religious group in America. The Southern Baptist Convention has lost over 2 million members since 2006. Younger evangelicals in particular are leaving at unprecedented rates. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of these scandals is how they have destroyed not just faith in religious institutions, but faith itself. Dr. Julie Roy, an investigative journalist who has spent years documenting evangelical scandals, puts it this way: "These weren't just administrative failures or theological disputes. These were fundamental betrayals of everything these institutions claimed to represent. When you discover that the people who taught you about God's love were actually enabling child abuse, it doesn't just make you question the church, it makes you question whether God exists at all." The ripple effects extend far beyond individual faith crises. The evangelical scandals have had profound political implications, contributing to the rise of what some scholars call post-Christian conservatism, a movement that maintains conservative political positions while abandoning the Christian justifications that once supported them. The scandals have also had broader cultural implications. The moral authority that evangelical leaders once wielded in American society has been completely undermined. When pastors who preached about family values were caught in sex scandals, when Christian universities covered up rape, when denominational leaders protected child abusers, the entire notion of religious moral authority became a punchline. This collapse of moral authority has created a vacuum that has been filled by increasingly secular voices on both the left and right. The Christian America that evangelical leaders once claimed to represent has become a historical artifact, replaced by a more pluralistic and often cynical culture that views religious claims with deep suspicion. Perhaps most tragically, the scandals have made it much more difficult for legitimate religious voices to address genuine moral issues. When evangelical leaders speak out against social problems today, their words carry little weight because their moral credibility has been destroyed by decades of hypocrisy and corruption. The silence of the believers who have walked away is perhaps the most powerful testimony to the depth of the betrayal. These aren't angry apostates seeking to destroy religion. They're heartbroken former believers who trusted their leaders and had that trust violated in the most horrific ways imaginable. Many of them describe their departure not as a liberation, but as a loss. They've lost their communities, their support systems, their sense of meaning and purpose. Some have found new spiritual homes in other traditions or non-traditional spiritual practices. Others have embraced secular worldviews, but all of them carry the scars of having their deepest beliefs weaponized against them by the very people they trusted most. As we look back on this dark chapter in American religious history, several lessons emerge. First, unchecked power corrupts, even within religious institutions, perhaps especially within religious institutions, where leaders are presumed to have divine authority. Second, institutional self-preservation almost always trumps justice for victims when scandals emerge. Third, the most vulnerable members of religious communities, children, women, minorities, bear the heaviest cost when leadership fails. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: silence in the face of abuse is not neutral. Every time a church member suspected abuse but said nothing, every time a denominational leader prioritized reputation over protection, every time a victim was counseled to forgive and forget rather than seek justice, the systems that enabled abuse grew stronger. The believers who drove away in silence were not weak or faithless. They were people who recognized that the institutions they had trusted had become so corrupted that they could no longer distinguish between good and evil. Their silence was not indifference, it was heartbreak. Today, as some evangelical organizations attempt to rebuild their credibility and as new religious movements emerge to fill the vacuum left by the scandals, the question remains: have we learned from this dark chapter in American religious history, or are we doomed to repeat it? The answer may depend on whether we can create religious institutions that prioritize truth over power, victims over reputation, and genuine accountability over the appearance of righteousness. The evangelical scandals that drove believers away in silence represent one of the most significant religious upheavals in American history. They remind us that moral authority cannot be claimed. It must be earned through consistent action, genuine accountability, and unwavering commitment to protecting the most vulnerable. Until religious institutions embrace these principles, the silence of those who walked away will continue to speak volumes about the true cost of betrayed trust. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of American religion's darkest chapters. These stories are difficult to tell, but they're essential to understanding how we got to where we are today. If this video provided value and insight, please consider leaving a super thanks to support the channel. Make sure to subscribe for more investigative historical content, and I'll see you in the next video where we continue exploring the events that shaped our world.